My name's Colin Mayer. I'm a professor at the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. I've been at the Saïd Business School since its start in 1996. I was the first professor and I helped to create the business school, becoming dean between 2006 and 2011. The main focus of my work at present is on the notion of responsible business and how business can really help to address many of the issues that we face as people, societies, and the natural world. And that has been also the focus of work that I've been doing recently with the British Academy in London on a program called The Future of the Corporation. And what that program seeks to do is to determine how business needs to change over the coming decades to address the economic, social, and environmental problems that it faces, as well as to take advantage of the immense technological opportunities that are in progress. Well, the pandemic has had a very substantial effect, not only just in terms of shifting the focus of my activities from the university to my home, but more substantially in terms of the issues that I'm focusing on in terms of the role of business in society, because it's had a very dramatic effect, of course, on business. And I think one of the key lessons that we're learning from the pandemic is not only how it's affecting business, but how it's affecting the whole of the management of economic systems around the world. In particular, the government has had to address the question of how can they best cope with the pandemic. And one point that I think has emerged very strongly from it is the idea that what seems to be an important element in addressing all major shocks is to be able to experiment and innovate. And what is particularly required is the idea that centralization by governments in terms of providing single solutions to problems are not in general the right way of trying to address these issues. That there is a high degree of uncertainty, what has been termed radical uncertainty, surrounding major crises. And to address that high level of uncertainty, one needs to recognize that one does not have the known solutions to those problems. And so one of the issues that has particularly arisen in the case of the UK is that by trying to centralize the approach of solving problems, there's been a failure to really experiment sufficiently. And that's an aspect that I think is becoming increasingly appreciated as people, for example, compare what has happened in the UK with that in Germany, that has responded with a more decentralized approach of experimentation to the problem. The lockdown as an academic has perhaps had less impact on my life than it has had on many other people. I'm fortunate in terms of having a very pleasant house in Oxford in which I could lock down. And that has allowed me to go on functioning in terms of performing the role that I do in terms of research and teaching. And in fact, in some respects, not to have had to have flown around the world and instead of zooming around the world, zoom around the world electronically has actually been, in many respects, quite a relaxing experience. The one area where it has had quite a profound impact is in terms of my role as a lecturer in the university and lecturing in particular to the MBA students. Now, from their perspective, having to engage electronically has been a serious disturbance because in particular an MBA program depends on a very high degree of interaction between the students. However good the interaction is electronically, it cannot replicate the type of impression and experience that students have when they are in a classroom together. I think one of the main things that one learns about oneself in a period such as this is the extent to which one can, as individuals, operate in a way in which the degree of self-sufficiency that one has in a very isolated context is much greater than one might appreciate. And that the ability to sustain relationships with people while clearly benefiting from direct human contact can also be undertaken at a distance. And I think one of the things that we've all learned is how technology has allowed us to operate at a distance across the world in a way in which still allows one to not only communicate, but to very effectively engage in interactions with other people. So one, and I in particular, have missed greatly the ability to be able to connect with people on a personal basis. But I think what one also learns is how can one still have connections which are less physical in nature. No, I can't say I'm not inherently a lonely or depressed person. So I found that I coped very well with this particular circumstance. Because I've had more time, I haven't had to spend so much time on planes and going to the vast number of meetings and conferences that I would otherwise have attended. So I've had more opportunity to write. And that notion of being able to think and reflect, I think has been a remarkably strong sense of comfort to me during this period. No, I didn't see the pandemic having the effect that we've currently observed. Of course, I'd heard of the risks associated with pandemics, but I did not anticipate anything like what has materialized. Now, that's very different from the financial crisis. So the financial crisis, I actually wrote an article 20 years earlier in 1986, setting out the process by which I expected the things like the financial crisis to happen. So that did not come to me as a shock at all. But the economic impact that this pandemic has had is not something that I anticipated. I think in terms of experiences of the world around me, yes. Is this something that will leave the greatest lasting impression on me? Probably not. I think that personal experiences rather than general global experiences have leave a stronger imprint in one's mind in some regards. We will be observing is an increasing frequency and intensity of crises going forward.
Can you explain what kind of crises?
Yes. So we all know about the environmental and climatic change crises that are going to affect us. But we are going to see much more in the way of social disturbances happening. And what's happened to date has been, to my mind, probably quite modest in relation to what's going to occur as the impacts, as we've just observed of the coronavirus, on the most vulnerable in society are going to very significantly intensify, and that will have very serious social repercussions. It has in the sense of it brings out extremes that have led me to reflect on what lessons I should be learning for the world around me and for my thinking. And it has, in that respect, considerably opened up my imagination and thoughts about the world around. Very profound insofar as they have brought out how vulnerable economies are, much more vulnerable than people ever imagined, how business is much more vulnerable than business ever imagined. There was a view that was beginning to appear before the crisis that business was bigger than governments. And what I think people have increasingly realized is how false that is and how dependent the business sector is on governments. But at the same time, governments have recognized how tremendously dependent they are on the business sector. So that mutual respect has intensified. And I hope it will be a positive outcome. Because the pandemic has, I think, had at least as significant an impact on people's views about how economies need to change going forward as the Great Depression. And in some respects, I think the repercussions of it going forward will be even greater. Now, the reason for that is that there is a growing recognition that it's not the end of the road in terms of crises. It's the beginning of the road. And in that respect, there is a growing understanding that we have to, as nation states and as societies, find a way of coping with what is becoming an increasingly fragile world. So I think that in many respects, the lessons that are going to be learned from this pandemic and the subsequent ones are going to be particularly significant. Now, Milton Friedman once said that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that change occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. It's therefore our duty, he said, to develop new policies, keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And I think that is exactly what we're going to observe. And the only question that really arises is, how many crises are we going to need to have before we recognize how fundamentally we need to change the way in which we organize our economies, businesses, and societies? It took the world approximately until the end of the 1950s to fully recover. I mean, in economic terms, there was obviously a rapid recovery during the war in terms of economic activity, but you can't really regard the war as being a period of recovery as such. The time it took to actually get back to acceptable economic and social conditions was, I think, the middle towards the end of the 1950s. And so that was a very lengthy recovery period. Now, how long is it going to take us to recover from this particular crisis? The answer is, in terms of economic recovery, it probably will be fairly drawn out. But as we saw with the financial crisis, and was true of the Great Depression, it's not simply the time it takes for economies to recover that matters. It's the time it takes for people and societies to recover. And what we observed from the financial crisis was that the real scar was not just an economic one. It was a deep breakdown of trust. And a loss of trust in society is one of the most damaging elements of what these crises do. And so that is what I fear the most as being the enduring repercussion of this, that it will leave a deep scar in terms of the extent of unity in society. Now, there was a notion of us coming together as communities, but that I fear may be quite short-lived before people really recognize the extent to which it's accentuated divisions in the world in which we live. And unless we find a way of really reforming our system in such a way as to provide a more coherent, inclusive society that doesn't have the impact of disadvantaging those who are most vulnerable, as this crisis has done. A lot of social change. So bringing about social change is a complex exercise, but I'll give you an illustration of where I think we're going to need to see a very substantial amount of social change in the UK. And that is in terms of the massive degrees of regional disparity in the UK. The UK is one of the most regional, unequal economies of any major economy in the world. And there's a long history as to why that's the case. But the government prior to the pandemic placed regional levelling up as being a key objective. And it's gained increasing significance because in the process of impacting the economy, what COVID has done has been to accentuate those regional disparities. And if we don't build the economies in terms of addressing those inequalities, then the social problems will be still further accentuated. So we're going to have to see a significant shift in terms of the allocation of activities across the UK over the coming years. We could well do. In some respects, we've already seen some evidence of that. And we can anticipate that if people feel that the system is not responding to their needs, then we will see actions being taken that will create a great deal of political and social disturbance. So yes, I could well imagine that happening. Not in the immediate future, because one of the changes that occurred was to increase the degree of provisions and reserves of the bank so that they've been able to weather this storm. But we're now going to see a wave of bankruptcies on a very substantial scale as the support for business begins to be removed. And as that happens, the banking system faces a very difficult problem in terms of the managing of the restructurings that are going to be needed. Now, it's going to be critically important that this is understood to be a joint problem that the private and the public sector need to address. The ultimate loser from a wave of failures will be the government that put up the substantial loans to the private sector. So what we're going to require is an approach by which governments begin to extend the funding, but not in the form where they are engaging with or lending directly or owning directly the corporate sector, but where they are channeling funds through a more effective financial system to the corporate sector. We will be issuing the equivalent of war bonds in the form of green bonds going forward to address the equivalent of the military conflicts that we faced in the past, namely in terms of the environmental conflict. And so that we will see governments using their funding through capital markets increasingly to address the problems that we face. But it's going to take not just that sort of public market funding, it's also going to need a change in approach on the part of private investors in terms of the way in which they support companies going forward. And that type of partnership between the public and the private sector is going to be critically important. The debt repayment is perhaps not the primary issue that we face at the moment, because interest rates are so low. Servicing that debt has been something that has not imposed a substantial burden on the corporate sector, on the public sector. It's more a matter of the way in which that public debt then gets reflected in private sector debt. That's the problem. And that's precisely what we've observed happening, that the way in which the government has extended finance to the corporate sector has been predominantly in the form of loans. Now, whereas the public sector, so long as it's not got a servicing requirement in terms of interest payments, that's prohibitively expensive, can manage it, the private sector clearly has a limited period within which to repay those loans. And that's where the real burden is going to fall. And that's why one needs to find a way of shifting public sector debt into private sector equity. And that's where the transformation function of the financial sector in terms of bringing about that is going to be so important if we're not going to have calamitous outcomes. No, it's not just growth. It's finding a way of mobilizing the corporate sector to solve problems. We have created an immense amount of growth, and that's been very important for promoting economic prosperity, but at the expense of creating massive problems, massive social problems, human problems in terms of a strong sense of disaffection on the part of societies and individuals around the world, and of course, massive environmental problems. And we cannot have a system by which we grow out of some problems and grow into even bigger problems. We need to find a way in which we create an economic system and a business sector that recognizes its role is to solve problems, not to create problems in the process of solving them. And we haven't yet structured our systems in such a way as to do that. Margaret Thatcher certainly recognized the importance of building an economy that was going to be more resilient, less exposed to the very clear vulnerabilities that existed at that time, and solved some problems, but in the process created others. And that is exactly what I'm talking about, that we haven't got away from that. We're still operating in a political and economic sphere which understands how one can address some issues, but not address issues in the round. So privatization was in many respects a significant development, but has been subsequently revealed to have created lots of problems. And the reason why we're in this position is that we are not promoting the notion that a fundamental function of economies and of business is to solve problems, and to do so in an economically and commercially viable way. The way in which I define it is in terms of the purpose of business is to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, and not to profit from producing problems for people and planet. We simply have not captured this idea that a company should not record a profit if it's producing a problem, and it hasn't tried to clean up the mess it's created. So it isn't very difficult to shift the system in such a direction that it profoundly alters the way in which people behave going forward. But until it's recognized that those who are benefiting, those who are accumulating massive amounts of wealth during this crisis, are doing so not at the expense of others. Until that is thought to be the case, we are going to intensify the social problems that we've currently encountered. That, James, is a counterfactual question, which is particularly difficult to answer, because not only does one have to put Margaret Thatcher into the context of the current situation, but one also has to say, well, how would she have been affected by what she's observed? And how might she have changed her attitudes and her policies as a consequence of what she's observed over the last 20 years? And to do that, I think is quite a tall order. But if I took the Margaret Thatcher of the 1980s and say, well, you know, what would she perceive as being the problems now? I think her view would be that, in essence, we need to ensure that the economy, the business sector, can essentially go back to doing what it's done in the past in terms of promoting growth and investment, and should not be inhibited by the state in doing that. And that is the fastest way of getting us out of our current dilemma, because after all, she did inherit a period of recession, very bad economic performance. Now, do I think that that solves the problem? It comes back to what I was saying earlier on. It may solve the problem in one respect, but it's likely to cause massive problems in other respects. And I think that what basically happened after her period, or even during her period, was that those problems began to surface really quite rapidly. The evidence in terms of the impact, in terms of the health effects of the way in which we've managed the crisis, has not suggested that we've done well in terms of the speed of the response, in terms of the nature of the response, and in particular in terms of the way in which we have tried to manage it. Now, of course, one can say it's all very well to look back with hindsight, but in essence, the best form of analysis that we can undertake is in terms of international comparisons and evaluate how well one government appears to have done in relation to others. Now, there are obvious problems with doing that because circumstances vary. But on most scores, the response of this government in this country to what has happened seems to have left a lot to be desired, and a lot of lessons that could have been learned in terms of the speed and the nature of the response. I think in terms of the immediate bailout of the business sector, that was absolutely the right thing to have done. Indeed, what saved us during the financial crisis was basically Gordon Brown's intervention, by which he cajoled countries around the world to take a concerted effort to bail out the banking sector. And if that hadn't happened, consequences would have been absolutely devastating. And likewise, and actually more significantly, if governments around the world had not intervened on the scale at which they did in March and April, then the consequences of that would have been beyond imagination. So I think that that was absolutely right. The question is, what happens next? It has to answer that, not so much in terms of the question of to what extent is a sector ailing, but in terms of what is the potential for that sector going forward and how does it need to change going forward. Now, one of the key problems that the government and the financial sector faces now is how does it distinguish between the gems and the fakes? That is to say, those that are potentially really important companies that have a potential for putting themselves back on their feet and flourishing, as against those that are simply not viable going forward. So there is that selection requirement in terms of identifying what really needs to and should be bailed out at this point. But there's then a second question about, well, what type of recovery do we want to have? And how do we encourage companies going forward to recognize that what is anticipated of them is very different from what happened in the financial crisis? I just said that, you know, what Gordon Brown and other governments did in terms of bailing out the banks was absolutely right. And there was initially a considerable amount of public and political support for that, because there was a realization that that was needed to save our financial systems. But that rapidly turned to derision when banks failed to respond, or failed to respond sufficiently rapidly in recognizing that they operated under a social license to operate. There was an expectation as to what banks should be doing to uphold our interests as customers, as lenders and borrowers and society more generally. And they failed to do that. Now, if that happens this time round, and business doesn't realize, you know, what people are expecting of it in terms of the nature of the recovery, the political ramifications are going to be far more serious than during the financial crisis. Yes, there are lots of special cases, but it's certainly a very important special. Why do I say that so definitively? Because education is so important for everybody. And I want to come back to one of the points I was making earlier on about the failure of government in this country and in some other countries to recognize the importance of letting go, devolving control to localities, to regions, to cities, because those know the problems that they face and need to resolve, and central government doesn't. But there is a strong sense that they can't let go, because the degree of knowledge and expertise as to how to do it doesn't exist. And because we've run such a centralized system, we have indeed run down the quality of administration that we have in many parts of the country. And it's vital that we build the educational capabilities to allow that sort of administration to be done on a very local basis. Now, to do that, we need to recognize that education is not just about providing people with the skills of a university and intellectual skills. It's about training and skills of people in different types of professions, and also in the public sector. And we need to develop the capability of providing people with that sort of knowledge and skills that allows people to have trust in them to delegate decision taking down to local levels, down to the shop floor, so that we don't run all our organizations and administrations from the top. I think that education has not always understood its purpose and what it's there to do. I'll give you an illustration in terms of the key role that further education colleges should be performing and doing exactly what I'm talking about in terms of allowing people to develop the skills base. The extent to which we have invested in that part of our economy, I think, has been seriously deficient. And that it's when educational institutions have a clear understanding of what role they are playing in society, that they can then function in such a way as to start addressing the real needs that we face as individuals and societies. So I don't think crisis is the word that I would use. I would use the notion of opportunity. And that's really a lot of my views about the current pandemic crisis as a whole. View it as an opportunity, not simply as a crisis, an opportunity to put back onto a sound footing areas of our economy and our institutions that were seriously in need of reform beforehand, but have now been shown to be much more exposed than they previously were. And I think education falls into that category of having been demonstrated to be very exposed and in need of some quite fundamental reforms going forward. Yes, I think we will observe that some universities and colleges are simply not financially viable. Not the norm in the sense that it substitutes for personal learning. It's like technology in so many regards. Technology is a remarkably valuable addition to human interaction. But it's not a substitute for human interaction. And we should recognize, on the contrary, what technology allows one to do is to have more human interaction. But it allows one to take the repetitive, more mundane elements of the way in which we interact with each other out of our interactions and allow us to focus on what really matters. And that's going to be true of education. We're going to be able to get the best lecturers and professors online lecturing to us. You won't have to go along to see a lecture by your own local university professor. But that won't substitute for the direct interaction between a student and their teacher. And so what it will allow is for that much more personal interaction, which has been a feature, in particular of my university at Oxford and at Cambridge, to become a much more widespread form of university, college, school teaching across the board. What I want to see coming out of the technological revolution is a greater emphasis on the human element, not a smaller emphasis. Potentially fantastic. Why? Because what I think Europe has demonstrated is that it can provide an alternative to the extremes that we've observed in both the US and in China in terms of a more inclusive, pluralistic approach to the way in which we run our economies and societies, where we can enjoy a far more greater degree of diversity, of lifestyles, of political systems, where we are not simply emphasizing either the functioning of markets on the one hand or the need for state control on the other, but realizing that actually there is a very powerful technique for bringing together different parts of economies to promote a much more successful system of operation than one observes elsewhere in the world. So the potential for Europe is phenomenal. The potential for it to fail is also immense. And which of those occurs depends on how it's run from the center. If Europe tries to run itself as a United States of Europe, it won't work because it cannot, in essence, create the same sort of political center that exists in the United States. And that's not really where its strength lies. But in terms of creating an environment in which many different types of approaches are followed and can yet exist together, then Europe's potential will be realized. And that requires exactly what I was talking about in relation to domestic governments, the notion of being able to let go, to encourage decisions to be taken at a national and a local level. So what one's observing in terms of the dispute over Brexit, I think, is very unfortunate, because it should be recognized that different countries should be able to operate within the system in very different ways, and to feel that they are part of it, but in a way that is suited to their particular way of operating. And I think that type of outcome going forward is what we will see Europe steadily moving towards. At least that is what I very much hope to see emerging. Over the next few years, I think that the UK is going to go through a very difficult period. And the reason for that is that I think that its economic system is not well structured to deal with the type of shock that we've just encountered. I think the high degree of centralization, both within the public sector and also in terms of the way in which we run the private sector from the City of London, I think that creates serious problems. And I think that we have a significant issue in terms of the way in which we're going to be able to manage the current crisis alongside the process of trying to separate ourselves from Europe. So it's going to be a complex and difficult period over the next few years. How is the UK going to do in the long term? That very much depends on how it decides to restructure its institutions going forward. Now, the UK has a very pragmatic approach to such issues. It's got a very strong analytical basis. It has a history and an underpinning of philosophical ideas that could be a very sound basis for reforms going forward. So I'm hopeful that in the medium term, those ideas will begin to prevail, because coming back to Friedman's notion that it's the ideas that determine the actions that are taken, those ideas that prevail in Britain could be a very positive basis for reform going forward. Through what I think it was doing approximately 10 years ago, when it was recognizing that it was on a path to reform that meant it was embracing some of the ideas from other countries around the world, but not seeking to do so in a way that involved implementing the standard types of capitalist systems that were seen to be the dominant forms. So it was looking for an alternative form of freeing up the economy. But then from about 2012-13 onwards, it went in exactly the opposite direction of centralizing control and introducing what has become an increasingly autocratic system of government. And I don't think that that's healthy for China. I don't think it's healthy for its interaction with the rest of the world. And I don't think ultimately that is what China will do. I think that there will be a reversal, and I hope it's a reversal to shift it more in the direction that it was moving in about 10 years ago. But likewise, I think that other countries need to go through significant degrees of reform as well. I do not by any means think that this is a problem that only China has imposed on the world. I think that the United States has to go through a very significant degree of reform, and the prospect of that happening in relatively short order, I think, has increased significantly over the last few months. And if both those reforms happen, then I think the world that we could inherit post-COVID could be a very different one, and potentially a far less fraught one. The importance of community, that we are individuals who flourish as social beings from the interactions that we have with others, and that the potential for us to work and live together is remarkably great. And that if we find a way of doing that, then we prosper in every respect. And I think that's potentially one of the most valuable lessons that could come out of this current crisis.